Well, good morning. Welcome to our Leadership for Literacy webinar. I'm Amy Griffin. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of VAST. We have Cindy Babb for VAST with us as well. We're excited that you're joining us this morning to learn more about literacy. We're so excited to be partnering on this webinar with Just Right Reader, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Terry King Hunt to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this time of learning together. I hope that you are excited. You are absolutely in for a treat. My name is Terry King Hunt, and I am the Director of Impact and Learning at Just Right Reader. We'll talk a little bit more about who we are and what we do, but we are so excited to partner with VAS as well as with Dr. Pamela Sullivan, who is going to be sharing with us today. I'm going to take a little bit of a time to just introduce her to you. Her credentials and her bio is long. So I will just say that Dr. Pamela Sullivan is a distinguished professor at James Madison University. She specializes in early elementary and reading education. Her academic background includes degrees in psychology, school psychology, and she has a PhD in curriculum and instruction with a focus on reading from the University of Virginia. Her diverse experiences and her extensive research make her a prominent figure in both the educational and the scientific communities, with a focus on practical applications of her research in literacy. I'm excited. And so, without further delay, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Sullivan.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I am excited to do this talk. I have been running graduate classes for JMU for the last little over 20 years. And prior to that was teaching and being part of the Reading First grant over at UVA. And so this presentation is part of what I've been thinking about for a long time. How do we look at literacy and really raise overall rates of literacy across the board in education? I was reminded last night of why this is so important. I had the last meeting of one of my classes to mint 10 brand new literacy specialists, which is a shortage area in Virginia. So we're excited to put a few more out there. And they were doing reflections on why they had come into our program and what they had learned and where they wanted to go next. And to a person, every single one of them talked about coming into a to be able to answer the question for themselves, why are my kids struggling with reading? And this was true across the board for the group. And we had everything from a kindergarten teacher to a long-term first grade teacher, someone who is already an interventionist, and 3 high school teachers in the group. And every single one of them came in with exactly the same question. And it was really interesting to me to hear that they also, across the 2 years of study, had come to the same conclusion. And that was that a lot of what we're doing in the schools is the right thing for kids with literacy. But the schools can't solve the problem alone. And to a person, every single one of them had come to see that the problem was not the transition from home to kindergarten or from kindergarten to first grade or from middle school to high school, that the problem is that we're running separate systems to try to impact literacy and that we need to see the system as a whole. And it was a really great reminder for me of why this talk and this set of slides is so important. Because we talk about where we specialize, right? Literacy is a huge topic. It is lifelong. It impacts people in their schooling. It impacts them in their home life. It impacts them in their health decisions. We know that it goes across the board in people's lives. And yet, when we think about literacy, we tend to focus. So even in my bio, you could hear early elementary and literacy, right? I had to specialize because it's such a big problem. And so one of the things that I've been working on and some of my more recent writing that some has come out and some are in the process of being published has been looking at our system and how do we in the schools interact with that system and what role do we play? And thinking about what can leadership do to raise literacy rates sort of across the board. So without further ado, we're going to jump into that. Oops. If I can remember how to move my slides forward, we're going to jump into that. Okay. Um, so one of my many jobs across the years was as a project manager for UVA when the Reading First grant was being implemented. And project management is near and dear to my heart. It is the science of making things better and making things happen. And I love that. And so I've continued with my reading and my thinking about project management, even though as a professor, my projects are pretty cut and dried. And I don't really need to study the science of project management anymore. I still enjoy looking at it. And this summer, I came across the iceberg theory. And I came across it in relation to commercial entities. And the question that they were asking for leadership is, why do we solve what seems to be the same problem over and over again? And the iceberg theory talks about how when we are trying to lead our way out of a problem, we actually are usually seeing just the tip of the iceberg. And what we are doing is reacting to recent events. And it really struck a chord with me. In education, we tend to refer to it as the pendulum swing rather than the iceberg theory. But the pendulum swing has been a question I have answered in every single class since I started teaching 30 years ago. Why do we run around and solve the same problems over again? Why can't we find that middle road and think our way out of the problem? And so for me, this was part of how the iceberg theory really resonated, because it talks about reacting to events at the surface level. It talks about the level just below the surface being patterns and trends. Beneath that, there are the structures that can help or hinder us as we're solving problems. And the very deepest level of the iceberg is the mental modes that we hold, the assumptions, the beliefs, the values. What is our job? What do we think should be happening? This is where we can transform things, but we have to start with our own mental models. And it was a really interesting piece for me to come across. The relationship to literacy, the way I like to talk about it, is with technology, right? Because that, over the course of my 30 years in education, has gone from no one having computers to everyone having one that you can hold in your hand or even wear on your wrist. Yes. And just this last year, Virginia banned cell phones during instructional hours. And I've been part of that whole trend to think about technology and what does it do for kids. And so when we think about what we're reacting to, right, we're reacting to the patterns and the trends. Banning cell phones in schools was very much about a recent group of studies that had talked about how harmful technology is to our attention spans, to our ability to concentrate, to our ability to filter, to our ability to think deeply. And so it seems to be at the second level of the iceberg. But I just reviewed an article that really had a different mental mode toward technology than a lot of those studies. And I realized that the problem that we really need to deal with that we haven't yet addressed is what's the role of technology in conjunction with developing brains, right? We're starting to think about that in literacy with regards to AI and writing. And I'm encouraging my students to really challenge their assumptions and beliefs. Is there a reason why kids need to learn how to write the old-fashioned way without technology? Or is the prevailing thought of this is going to be in their lives, they need to learn how to navigate it? Which of those is actually the mental model we want to be functioning in? And once you challenge that mental mode, you can then build the structures. You can change the patterns and the trends, and you can stop the running around the tip of the iceberg reacting to events. And so today's talk is going to be challenging a little bit what we think we know about leadership for literacy, reconceptualizing what is actually our job to do, who are our partners, and what should we be thinking about. So part of this talk for me came about because of the most recent Virginia Literacy Act, which is not really a policy, it's actually a law in the state of Virginia. But looking at it while I was working with teachers and thinking about sort of the focus of this new policy and how narrow it was, right? It's a K through 3 policy. It is one of the most prescriptive that we've had in the state. And so thinking back, and I was part of Reading First, this policy is actually really laying out what teachers should use and what they should do, what's not available to be used in the schools. There was minimal stakeholder engagement. And what people are seeming to realize right now is it was lacking evaluation and revision options, right? So as new information came in, it's harder to change a law. And so my students were asking me, as we implemented this over the last 2 years, how do we stop simply reacting and really move forward with organizational and cultural change? What would be a way of thinking about policy or thinking about leadership that would cover birth to early adulthood? And how can we actually put those practices into place? So my example that I'm going to use for you today, and Terry has seen this often, this is one of my favorite scary slides, is to think about whether or not kids come into school ready to learn to read. Right? What are their early literacy experiences? And these are a set of statistics that I go over all the time in my classes. So essentially, one of the things that we know is that households that have strong literacy, and we usually measure that by maternal education level, will, for the most part, have kids who come to kindergarten prepared to learn how to read. And we usually consider that to be knowing the alphabet, having been read to, having a sense of story, understanding concepts of print, right? Good phonological awareness skills, knowledge of rhyme, all of those types of things. When kids come to school without those skills in place, they struggle from the very beginning. And there is research that goes back decades saying that the kids who struggle at the very beginning continue to struggle all the way through life. So if we think about one of the charges being to raise our literacy levels overall so that all of the children that graduate from our schools come out at a higher literacy level, then one of the problems that we have to think about is where were the kids when they came in? And schools have very much been reacting to this. This has been a tip of the iceberg problem for decades. So this set of scary statistics is looking at what are the literacy practices in the home before school. And they are measuring the percentage of children aged 3 to 5 who are read to 3 or more times a week. And it's from 1993 to 2019. And I stop it at 2019, even scarier when we get into COVID and the more recent years. And we will talk about that when we see this slide again. So when I talk to my students about changing literacy rates and doing more than reacting, this is where I always like to start, right? We have no control over the mother's education level. And yet, if you look at the factor for kids, this slide is divided into the very top line is mothers that have college or beyond education. And it changes how they behave in their own family prior to the kids entering school. So those are the moms that are reading to their kids 3 or more times a week, and they do it at a 90 to 95% rate. The second line, the orange line, is moms who have some college. So an associate's degree, a trade school certificate, some college. And they are still pretty high up there. They are reading anywhere from 80% to close to 90% of the time. They are sharing books with their children 3 to 5 times a week. Next level is a high school diploma. And you can see these levels start to go down. 80% is the highest. It goes down to about 70%. And then the lowest level is moms who didn't graduate from high school. And they are ranging anywhere from 50% to maybe 65% of the time they do this. Now, this is scary enough. This data actually goes back to the 1970s. So we have known about this for decades. Here's the thing that scares me the most. From 1993 to 2019, even though we know the statistic, even though we're tracking this statistic, the lines are relatively flat. We're not seeing good increases at any level. And we're not seeing the levels come together in the middle. We're not closing that gap at all. So when you think about education in the school system as part of an overall system that encompasses kids, this is a huge opportunity to have an impact on literacy levels. Okay. So that's my scary statistic. And then everybody's going to recognize Bronfenbrenner, right? We love him. If you've taken a child development course, you know Bronfenbrenner. This is the theory that a child exists in some nesting systems, and that the overall system is the bioecological systems model. So in other words, a child brings individual characteristics to the table. I have a child who is probably the most driven young person you will ever meet. My challenge as a parent every day is to get her to sit at least for 5 minutes and do nothing and breathe and reset her brain. Right? She is best friends with a child who is her exact opposite, a child whose parents' challenge is to get him moving off the couch. They balance each other really nicely. But each child brings their own executive function levels, their own personality, their own interest in literacy, right? And that's the inherent circle with child characteristics. The child is then surrounded by a microsystem, family, teacher, classmates, friends, and they all have influence on that child. The exosystem is the whole school. It's the community. It's the church. It is looking at where that child is growing up. Macrosystem is the culture in which they are growing up. And overlapping the entire thing is what Bronfenbrenner referred to as the chronosystem, the sense of time. Kids are growing up very differently today than they were in the 1970s. And that's because our historic context is different. With kids, though, we need to think about, whoops, let me go back, the fact that they are also growing through this period of time. And so a child at age 4 has different literacy needs than a child who's struggling with reading and is age 16. So the chrono system, it's important that we divide that into two pieces. Okay. So when we think about this for literacy, if we think about that macro system, the overall cultural perceptions of the benefits of literacy, to take it back to the technology issue, that's been shaken lately, right? If machines can write for us, if they can summarize and find the main point and answer questions faster than we can, when I talk to my students, I ask them how many of them choose to use a paper map as opposed to Google Maps in their car, right? We are on the cusp of a similar shift for creating content and intellectual property. Finance and priorities at a national level, this comes in the macro system. We are in the middle of a big shift there too, right? That we were, I think, not prepared for, any of us. Where is the funding going to come from? What is going to be the role of state versus federal? All of that is changing right now. Within the exosystem, we have specific literacy policies, and that can include things like it can include things like how much writing is required. And what we're doing is taking those values from the macro system and translating them into policies. We then get to the mesosystem, which is community interactions and partnerships. What do we expect of our teachers? What kinds of trainings are we putting on? And then finally, we get to the microsystem. What's happening in individual classrooms? What books are in the library? What are the family literacy practices? And those are very much influenced by every other level. Chronosystem, where is your child at this point in time? I could not be more grateful that AI did not come out until a year or two ago because my child learned how to write. And she had to because no one was doing it for her, right? Generational understandings of literacy. What do we expect people to be able to do and understand? So again, for the chronosystem, for the kids, this has two pieces. It has new stakeholders, new ideas as we change places in history. And it has impact for the child because as the child grows as a literate human being, what works for them at one point in time will not work at another point in time. And so if I could talk someone into changing this theory, this would be the piece of it that I would change. I want both of those really specified for literacy. So then thinking back to the iceberg theory, right? Where are we reacting to all of these things that are going on? Are we aware of the patterns and the trends? AI has been a great example to use because it sort of hit and took over the news all at once. And people were thinking of it as something that was coming in a far off sci-fi future. But the reality was Google Maps has been using it for a while, right? And so we've actually all been part of this. And I love when we can see those patterns and trends and the changes in them. What does that mean about our structure? If we want to raise literate human beings, what structures need to be in place? How do they need to change? And then are we challenging our own mental models? The most frustrating answer that I get when I talk this through with my students is, well, I can't do anything about that. Okay, well, then stop complaining to me about the problem, right? If we are not challenging, if we are not willing to be one voice that pushes for a significant change, then nothing will ever change. And it starts with challenging your own mental model. So looking at if we revised our mental models, could we change things? Could we work toward an overall higher levels of literacy goal rather than reacting to each problem piecemeal? That involves seeing the trends. And we're going to go back to parents reading aloud in the years before school. We're going to see what that looks like. One of the trends that college professors have liked to talk about for the last couple of years is the fact that they can't assign full books anymore, that they feel like students don't have the attention and the sustained effort to make their way through an entire book. Um, and so thinking about which of these would make us rethink, what do we find to be important enough about literacy that we're willing to challenge those mental models, that we're willing to rebuild some structures? So these two things blend really well. Because if you take the iceberg theory as your own, I have to challenge this, I have to get to a deeper level, and then you use Bronfenbrenner as your template for the inputs and the interactions between levels to handle the problem, you actually have a nice way of thinking through what changes would you like to make. So thinking about that, one of the first things that we always have to do is know where we are. And Bronfenbrenner provides a nice map for this. Where are the kids, right? One of the things that I love to hear over and over again, usually from my undergraduates, as they, in their adult life for the first time, take a look at elementary school children. And the first problem that we address every semester is things are different than when I was in school. And I love hearing that from 20-year-olds. It makes me laugh every time. Um, but kids do change over time. Their challenges change. So where are they? Where are the teachers in the schools? What partnerships do you have? What resources are available? And how have they changed over time? And the best way to do this is to do a literacy audit. And that is simply looking at the whole picture. What do you have in place? What are your strengths? What needs attention? And are you a resource? I'm going to do my pitch for reading specialists here. One of the articles that I just wrote is almost fawning in its admiration for literacy specialists. But looking at the history of literacy specialists and looking at their role, literacy specialists occupy a really strange place in the organizations that are our schools. They are leaders who function almost purely at a one school level, and they have no formal power attached to their role, meaning they are informal influencers only. And when you look at this from a commercial company lens, it actually ends up making them one of the most powerful people in the organization. Because if you look at people who can see the overall whole and yet drill down and pinpoint for individual teachers what they need to be working on, literacy specialists are uniquely positioned to be a hub where leadership, parents, children, curriculum, all of that intersects at that one person. They are trained to be a resource for every single one of those stakeholders. They can interact with any of them. And they are skilled at navigating change where they don't have any of that formal power. So talking people who might be resistant to doing something differently through making a change is part of the skill set that they come out with. So when we think about literacy specialists, and one of the interesting pieces of data that we looked at when we wrote that article was the fact that effective schools, schools that are producing literate children above what you would expect from the income, are using their literacy specialists specifically in leadership roles and across the stakeholders to lead their changes. So your literacy specialist is uniquely qualified to do something like run a literacy audit and to think about where you can create those pivot points. Looking at Bronfenbrenner's model, where can you change something that's going to change your inputs for the next level. They are good at creating timelines and teams and defining goals and tasks. So moving your literacy specialist into a leadership position, into a true resource for the other teachers is one of the best places to start the change. All right. So then taking you back to the incoming students problem, thinking about where would you change things, right? What if we looked at this not as a problem that we have to solve, but a pivot point where we can make things better? We know since the 1970s, kids have been coming into school with different levels of literacy readiness. They've been coming in with different experiences. What if we changed that input? How would that change the rest of our model? And the scary statistic for this, and the reason why I feel like it's so important to bring it up over and over and over again, is because once we hit 2020, every single line actually decreases. The problem that we're facing right now in literacy is an overall decrease in rates of kids who are choosing to read, rates of parents who are choosing to share reading with their children, and skills. So we are facing an illiteracy, an illiteracy, and a shared reading crisis. And so I try not to show this graph after 2020 because it makes me very sad, because I'm not sure why any parents wouldn't share reading with their children. But in fact, we're choosing to farm that out. And so more kids are getting devices and not actual books and actual reading time. All right. So if our goal is that students enter school prepared to learn to read, we need to challenge our assumptions. And the biggest assumption is that we cannot control that. And we need to see ourselves as a pivot point. And so thinking about accessing research, what needs to be in place, what partnerships do you have? Right? Instead of thinking we don't control it, what control do we have? Could we be the pivot point by building those community coalitions, by partnering with hospitals, with pediatricians, with libraries, with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with the Y, all of these places that have a lot of influence over the early years. In my town in Central Virginia, we have very few child care centers per se. Those are mostly run by the churches. And so partnering with the churches do this, being the people who are willing to see it as a pivot point, but pulling every resource that we have in the towns. It means seeing ourselves as part of a coalition instead of a standalone entity. And then it means putting into place continuous assessment and revision, because that chrono system is still in place, right? And if we're facing declines after 2020, are we going to continue to face declines in shared reading over time? And are we going to need to up our support? Or is this the kind of thing where once we have talked through the problem with a generation of parents, it becomes embedded in the child's idea of parenting, and we see it take on a life of its own? The only way we know that is through continuous assessment of where are the kids when they hit kindergarten. Okay, so this is what it looks like if we pull it through Bronfenbrenner's model. The task is increasing levels of literacy and reading behaviors in the homes prior to school. Looking at the community, then we pull in what nonprofits can we partner with? What can we do for adult literacy levels? Where can we reach those families? Exosystem is where our assessment lives. Macro system has to do with setting and revising policy, right? So this has to become a priority at a cultural level. And then the chronosystem for kids, again, an infant in our community is going to maybe have different needs than a 4-year-old who joins from someplace else. So we can't assume that the same solution works for all kids. So I've put a lot out there. Um, it is a conceptual model. Um, from my part, it's a reaction to my students and the questions that they have been asking. But in the last, I would say, month, I have started to see it pop up at a conference where we talked about a systems approach for supporting teachers. I have seen it pop up in a nonprofit system um, where they talked about building coalitions and they're actually collecting data on the impact of coalitions. And I've seen it pop up twice now in the New York Times in the last week. So the idea that we need to stop defining ourselves as an individual entity, but see ourselves as part of the overall system and challenge that mental model to think about where we can be the pivot point. That's going to be the most important thing that we can do to raise literacy levels across the board for students, especially given that we cannot predict what's coming next, right? And what challenges they're going to face. So those are my thoughts for today. And I just wanted to say thank you for having me. I also wanted to say I'm happy to send you any of the data, including some of the unhappy data, which I choose not to put on my slides. But if you heard something and you want to know where it came from, my email address is on the screen, and I would be happy to take questions or chat with you at any time.
Does anyone want to come off mute and ask any questions or put questions in the chat?
Well, I'll use this opportunity while you're thinking about your questions, just to take a couple of minutes and say a little bit about Just Right Reader and why we're so excited to be able to partner with VASS, why we're excited to continue to lean in to the research and all that Dr. Sullivan just shared. I'm actually going to share my screen because I really appreciate the research and all of the data that Dr. Sullivan just said. So just as a way of introduction, Just Right Reader is a decodable resource company. Our goal really is to put books into children's hands. We have over 800 different titles of decodable books that are really focused on making sure that we follow the scope and sequence that allows students at the very early stages of literacy be able to practice the skills that they're learning in the classroom in real reading experiences so that they become joyful, so that become engaging. We make sure that we have video phonics lessons connected to every single title so that when teachers, students, parents are trying to understand better the skills and concepts that are being presented in the text, there's a video lesson that will give them that and really do it in a way that works well in that small group instruction. One of the things that Just Right Reader is committed to, and that really resonated with me, Dr. Sullivan, as you were talking, I am guilty, right? I am so guilty of picking up and getting my Audible or getting my Kindle because it's easy to travel with, right? And so my children don't see me holding books anymore. And I have a tendency to say, "Hey, want me to buy you a Kindle book?" Or and what you said to me to what I know is right as a literacy person and reminded me of the need to really keep kids reading and keep kids in books. And Just Right Reader is doing just that. We're working to get over 5,000 books in the hands of children so that they can continue to read over the winter break. Our decodables are specifically aligned with the students that are in our classrooms. So schools will send us their data for their children. We'll use that data to identify exactly where those students are working, and then we'll create packs of books that are aligned to where the students' needs are. Those packs come to the students with their names on them, and then they get to work on those skills in the classroom. But over the winter break, those books go home and they stay at home. And remember, every book has a QR code. So now we are really addressing that parent engagement part, that really how we can get parents reading with their children is by providing them the support to know how to do that. And those QR codes really allow parents to see the video, understand the skill, and then read with their children. And this is something we are doing. We're gifting these books to families. So if you are working with a school or a district and you want to make sure that your students can have this access to these books, I encourage you to register for the winter reading program. We will connect you with the books and the students and make sure that you can get these books in hand for your students. We're really excited about that. And I feel like as I was listening to you, Dr. Sullivan, it really reminded me of the importance of putting books in hands, empowering parents to read with their children, and giving them the skills and the tools that they need in order to do that. These literacy packs, we have them all the way from pre-K early knowledge, right? All the way through middle school. So we're really supporting students in all of the ways that we can. If you have questions about the winter break reading program, go ahead and send us an email, or you can scan that QR code to register and we'll get you connected in that way. Thank you so much, VASS, for this time.